Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Eric Geeson and I, Crystal White, for the condensed WSHFC Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Fundamentals class. Today we're going to be going over the low-income housing federal and state commitments and regulations. This training course is being presented as an interim fundamentals during the COVID-19 crisis. The webinar training is not in lieu of any of our full compliance fundamentals training courses, and we suggest that all participants participate in the full compliance fundamentals class upon scheduling. No certification will be issued for this webinar class. This is just strictly a learning tool to help get us through until after we can start visiting in person again. On your screen here, you're going to see a screenshot of our website. Under compliance, you're going to see here the yellow arrows are where you can locate our forms, income and rent limits, the tax credit compliance manual, and the tax credit compliance FAQs. The red arrow is our compliance workshop registration. So once we open up registration again, this is where you will go to register. Also, if you want to be the first to know or know anything that's going on in our world, any updates that we have come out usually in an e-news monthly newsletter. Most of the time that's monthly, but sometimes we do offer it as things pop up. Right now, because of COVID-19, any changes that we have to our FAQs or anything like that is usually posted in an e-news. To the left, you will see the news and highlights. We show here that the May Tax Credit Fundamentals and Advanced Compliance Workshops in Spokane is open, and that the tax credit compliance manual has changed. The tax credit class that was in Spokane scheduled for May is no longer going to be in May, or was not in May. And how you get to our basic website is www.wshfc.org. You can click on that hyperlink if you want to get there. One last thing is, if for some reason you have ever unsubscribed to our e-news, you will not get it anymore in the future unless you sign back up. So if for some reason you have clicked ignore in the past, you won't get any e-news in the future. So I would definitely recommend that you make sure that you have us so that you are able to get the emails. This right here is updated as of 4/13 of 2020. Any and all in-person compliance workshops have been suspended until further notice. We do ask before you come to an in-person training that in the red box in the middle of the screen, you watch the resident certification forms webinar before you come. Any webinars that we will be posting in the meantime should be posted on this page. We also have the link to our 2020 compliance update that we did a few weeks ago, Eric and myself. We have the link to the resident certification forms webinar. We also have the post-year 15 procedures webinar, and then some other courses that are from 2008 on calculating assets part 1 and part 2. The policies and regulations that are outlined today are the requirement of the IRS and of the Commission. Additional policies and procedures may be imposed by your management, owners, additional programs such as HUD, RD, Home, Housing Trust Fund, other local and state funding programs, and/or your syndicators. Check with your owner or management company if you're unsure of programs and policies for your property. So today, anything that we're going over is just strictly the IRS and the Commission. You could have additional funders, or you could have additional compliance specialists or different entities that will come in and say, I would like you to do this. It doesn't mean that we don't require it or that we can't require it. It means that they are asking you for additional forms and you would have to go with what they are asking you to do as well. And then I'm going to let Eric take over with federal requirements.
When the owner applies for tax credits, the owner makes a list of promises or elections that must be adhered to during the lifetime of the property. We're going to talk about many of the federal elections that the owner elects, and we are also going to talk about some of the state-specific elections for the property. Once the owner makes these elections, the property must adhere to these requirements for the duration of the property. The first set will be the federal elections. The federal election, once it is elected, cannot be changed. The first election is the definition of a building in the property. The buildings on the property can either be all buildings bunched together as one property, or each building on the property is its own property. So if you're at a property and it has building A, B, C, and D, the owner can elect whether each of those buildings are their own property for tax credits or all of the buildings together are one property. This is very important when it comes to transferring tenants. We are going to talk about the document and where to find the election later on in this presentation. One of the other elections that the owner has, the owner gets to elect the first credit year. Generally, the first credit year is when the building is fully occupied. However, the owner can elect whether it's that year or it's the following year. And the third election the owner can elect is the percentage of units that must meet the median income level. We have three options: 20% of the units in the property at the 50% level, 40% of the units in the property at the 60% level, or income averaging where the total units must be no higher than the 60% of the median income level. Once the owner elects these options, they are irrevocable and cannot be changed. Another federal requirement is the student rule. At a tax credit property, it is prohibited to have a unit occupied entirely by full-time students unless they meet an exception. The student rule must be reviewed annually, and the full-time definition is defined by the institution itself. If any student attends school full-time in any day of the month, 5 months out of the year, those 5 months do not necessarily need to be consecutive. They constitute as a full-time student for the calendar year and must wait for the next year. Generally, K through 12 is a full-time student, and if necessary, you need to verify the student status. There are 5 exceptions to this student rule. Exception number 1 is if a household member is receiving TANF. The next one is if a household member has been in or is in foster care anytime during their lifetime. Another exception is if a household contains a member who is getting assistance from the Workforce Innovation or Opportunity Act or an adult who are married and entitled to joint tax return. The adults in the household do not need to be married together. It could be somebody in the household who is married to somebody outside of the household. However, be careful, you may need to count that person's income also. The last exception is an adult household member who is a single parent with minor children. The adult is not a dependent of any third party, and the children are only claimed by a parent. That parent does not need to live in the household. It could be the other parent outside of the household in this case. Another one of the federal requirements is that you must meet the fair housing requirements. There are federal, state, and local requirements regarding fair housing. We highly recommend that you sign up for a fair housing class in your local jurisdiction to get specific training. Along with the federal requirements, there are local requirements. So contacting your local fair housing department and finding out what those requirements are is highly recommended. A couple of the other federal requirements is the unit, according to the IRS, the unit must always be suitable for occupancy, and the units must be available to the general public, meaning they cannot be held for any specific group of persons. They must meet the federal UPCS and local health, safety, and building codes. The IRS requires that all units be rent ready at all times. However, understanding that that is not necessarily always available, we do allow up to 30 days to make a unit rent ready. If it takes 30 to 90 days, as long as there is a detailed explanation and timeline presented on continuous work in the unit, it will be satisfactory. A situation or an example would be if during a turn, maintenance find out that there was heavy floor damage or water leak or such, and it takes extra time due to that repair. As long as you document dates the work was being done and provide an explanation, it will be satisfactory. Items that are not satisfactory is if there's no maintenance staff available, or there were large gaps in work being done at the property or in the unit. Any vacancies 90 days or greater, we must report as non-compliance. Once the owner makes these elections, the owner will complete an 8609 form. This is an example of that 8609 form. We are going to enlarge the bottom half of this form. On line 5 is the date that the building will be placed in service. On 8B, this is where the owner will elect whether the buildings on the property are being defined as their own individual property, or if all buildings together are going to be defined as a property. 10A will take the place and service date above and determine whether they are taking credits on that year or if the credits are being started the year following. And 10C is where the owner elects the minimum set aside. There are 4 options on here. The 4th option is for New York City only. This is where the owner will elect 20/50, 40/60, or income averaging. Once the owner elects these, they are irrevocable. I would recommend that you have a copy of this form so you verify what elections the owner has taken for the property.
So Eric just went over all of the federal requirements, and we're just going to make sure that we re-go over them so that you have a better understanding. Federal requirements are the minimum set-asides, either 20 at 50, 40 at 60, or income averaging. All residents must income qualify. Rents must remain rent restricted. All units must be suitable for occupancy. Units must be available to the general public. It's non-transient. Full-time student household prohibitions. So what constitutes an exception for the full-time student? And then you must abide by federal and local fair housing laws. Now we're going to go over state commitments. State commitments are commitments that the owner elected additionally on top of the federal commitments. So additional set-asides will be put in place for units at 30, 35, 40, 45, and 50. Lower income and rent limits may apply. And just as a reminder, set-asides generally float amongst all units in the property, except when it comes to market, transitional, and common area units. One of the state commitments is the disabled commitment. In order to meet this, all households must complete a disability certification form at move-in. If the property does not have this commitment, they do not need to fill out the disability certification form. Disability means a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities of an individual, such as not being able to take care of oneself, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, or learning. Qualify for set-asides if the household identifies at least one person in the unit that meets the definition and have a disability verification. Disability verification forms must be signed by an individual with knowledge of the household member's disability. Remember that site staff should not be signing this form. SSDI, SSDC are both acceptable forms of verification. On a mixed-use property, market units can meet the set-aside. So it doesn't all have to be the tax credit units if you have a mixed property. And once qualified, always qualified. The next one is large family commitment. The definition of a large family commitment is 4 or more household members in a 3-bedroom or larger unit. Again, once qualified, always qualified. If a household member vacates, lowering the unit below 4 people, the unit still qualifies. Once the household moves to a smaller unit, they are no longer qualified. So let's go over this. If you move in a household in the beginning and there are 5 people in the household, 2 of the people move out because they were children and moved out on their own, or a spouse moved out or something like that. It's once qualified, always qualified. So that household will always meet the large family commitment as long as they don't transfer to a different unit. Elderly household commitment. There are differences in these. So elderly household definition, the first one is 62 and older for all residents. Then there's another one that's 55 and older, at least 1 resident per household. Then there's 62 and older or disabled any age. And then there's HUD elderly. You're going to want to make sure that you know which one your property has. And we'll go over that later when we go over the regulatory agreement and you can see which one it is. Certifications must contain proof of age each year. So even though we know people are not getting any younger, you still have to provide the proof of age with every year's certification. The next state commitment is the homeless commitment. Support services must be provided to the household by a qualified nonprofit or government social entity. This needs to be approved by the commission. In order to change this, you would have to put in writing and give specific details to the director of the Asset Management and Compliance Division. This support services agreement is put in place in the beginning when you are placing in service at your building. Make sure that you have a copy of this so that you know what requirements you have to be able to provide the homeless commitment set aside. Homeless status and service plan must be followed for each household. This can be either a 10, 20, 50, or 75% commitment. Units not confined to just one building. This is throughout the property. Households are not required to relocate, and residents must sign at least a 6-month lease. Each household must complete a homeless certification form at move-in. On that certification form, it will ask the following questions. I am or we are without housing and live on the streets in a car or non-residential building. I am or we are without housing and spend the nights in shelters, institutions, or temporary housing. I am or we are staying with another family less than 30 days and there are not enough beds for everybody. And then I am or we are at risk of losing housing due to an eviction, sale of the current housing, loss of income, or other crisis. And the last one is, I am or we live in substandard housing as determined by a licensed housing inspector. Another state commitment that we don't currently have, but we did have, is the transitional commitment. Support services must be provided to the household by a by a qualified nonprofit or government service entity. So that's the same as the homeless. Homeless status and service plan must be provided for each household. Again, the same as homeless. And then number 3 can be either 10, 20, or 75% commitment, and it applies to all buildings. But they must relocate into permanent housing, not within our current property, after 24 months. The residents must sign leases, but they're not subject to 6-month minimums. And each household must complete the same homeless certification at move-in as the last screen under the homeless commitment. So the difference between homeless and transitional is one specific building. They have to relocate after 24 months, and they don't have to sign a 6-month minimum lease. And then Eric is going to take over farm worker.
The farm worker commitment must contain a household member that meets the farm worker definition per the RCW and in the Washington Administrative Code at move-in. The definition basically states that the farm worker will handle the raw product from between farm to market. The income from the farm work is not less than $3,000 per year, and you must verify that they have made this in the past and they are going to be making it in the future. At the move-in, the farm worker household must complete the farm worker household initial certification, and along with that, they will complete a verification of farm work status or provide copies of all W-2 forms from the farms that they have worked at in the past. You must review the past 12 months of income from farm work to project forward the 12 months of income that they're going to be making. And they must review income for the past 12 months of all income sources, meaning, did they work at the farm for a handful of months and then receive unemployment or other type of employment during the other months? You need to make sure you get a good picture of all of their income sources to be able to project forward what they'll be earning in the future. We have a 30-day rule that pertains to the state special needs commitments only. If you are unable to, or you do not have an applicant to meet a special need set aside of certain types of state commitments, we have a process that you can go to so you don't hold up your vacancy. One is the unit must be held vacant and in rent-ready condition for a minimum of 30 days while you market and advertise to that said population. So for example, if you have a disabled or a large family set aside, you want to make sure that you are marketing to that population during those 30 days. Your marketing must be in good faith. You need to actively market to that specific population and attempt to reach those populations in your marketing. At the end of the year, a special needs vacancy report is required to be submitted if you have not met your state special need commitments. This special need vacancy report is due with the annual report each January. The 30-day rule does not apply to elderly, transitional, or homeless units. Before the 30-day rule is effective, you must meet all state special need commitments upon lease up of a new property. In the new construction, those special need commitments must be met by the time that the property reaches 100% capacity. In acquisition rehab, the attrition rule applies. You can see Chapter 4 regarding those policies. And there's no double counting of commitments except in the 75% or higher state commitment properties. For example, if you have 100 units and you are required to have 10 disabled and 10 large family, the 10 large family households cannot also meet your count for the 10 disabled. It needs to be 20 complete separate households. However, if you have 75 required farm worker units and 10 large family, the 75% farm work is now 75% of the property. So therefore, the farm worker can also count as a large family if they also meet the large family set aside.
So just to go over our additional commitments, for state commitments, those are included in disabled, farm worker, large family, homeless / transitional. Remember, transitional is a building rule. Elderly household, which is a property rule, and additional income and rent restrictions that could be at 30, 35, 40, and 45%. There was a note on the bottom of that that said, set-asides generally float among all units at the property except when it comes to market, transitional, or common area units. Now we're going to go over the regulatory documents. What you see in front of you is a regulatory agreement. The federal term is extended use agreement. Washington refers to it as a regulatory agreement. Some other states call it a LURA or a LIRC, which is a land use restriction agreement or a land use restricted covenant. The official document containing the IRS, Washington state regulations, and information that's specific to this property is in here, and it's recorded at the county recorder's office, and it's attached to the property. It's about 56 pages, which also includes an Exhibit B, which I talked about earlier, that will show you a summary of all your requirements. You can see on the front page of this in the top right, that's the stamp showing that it's recorded and the date of when it was recorded. It's between the property and the Washington State Housing Finance Commission. And then it also lists the TCOAR number or OID number, which for this specific property in the bottom right, it's showing as 99-23M. The Exhibit B is this page. This is the most valuable page that we see as compliance analysts. This tells us the name of the project, which this one is Happy Valley Apartments, the OID or TC number, which this one is 99-23M. Those two things are important because when you send an email to your portfolio analyst for your property or our director or manager, you want to make sure that you list the name of the property along with that OID number, because we probably have I would say somewhere around 100 properties that have the same name. A couple of those could be village apartments or different things like that. So if you just send me an email and you sent it to me talking about village apartments, which is actually another portfolio analyst's property, I would answer based on my property. And if I didn't have that OID number, I wouldn't know that I was actually answering for a different person's property. So that's very important. Then it will list the owner, which in this case is Happy Valley LLC, the owner's address, and then who to contact for legal notices. This property is a for-profit owner. And then in the yellow, you will see the state elections that this property has. So this property has the first 15 years for federal, then it elected an additional 22 years for a total project compliance period of 40 years. Now you're saying, wait a minute, 22 plus 15 does not add up to 40, but there is an additional 3-year period in there that you have to count. So 15 plus 22 plus 3, this project needs to stay in compliance for 40 years. This property has 102 units. It has 2 common area units. And then the total housing units is 100. The applicable fraction for this property is 100%, so it's 100% tax credit. There are no market units. And the federal election that they chose is 40 units at 60%. So the red is federal, the yellow is state. So 60% units, it's got 100 units. It also has a state election that 25 units will be at 40%. It then has 20 units or 20% of the property for large household. It doesn't have any disabled units, and it doesn't have any elderly unit commitments. It also doesn't have any homeless or transitional, but it then has a farm worker election of 75 units or 75%. Remember what Eric said, if it's over 75%, you could have a double counting. Those are state elections. And then down in the bottom, it shows that this is a new construction property. Remember, you could either have new construction or you could have AC rehab, right? And then it shows you the bin number. This property has 4 buildings, each with their own bin number ending in 5000, 5001, 5002, and 5003. It then lists the address, the city and the state where those are located, the housing units per building, and then it lists your 2 common area units. Those common area units, as per this agreement, are in buildings ending in 5001 and 5003. So if they move throughout or have moved, you definitely need to make sure that you have backup documentation that your portfolio analyst approved your common area to either be moved or to be rented to a restricted tenant.
One of the items I'd like to point out on this regulatory agreement is not all regulatory agreements are clear and not all regulatory agreements are the same. In this regulatory agreement, we can see that there's 4 buildings, and the regulatory agreement shows that in each 4 of the buildings, there's a total of 25 units in each building. However, if we remember back to the previous page, we actually have 102 units on our property. Well, here it lists we have a total of 25 units in each building, and 25 units in each building are for low-income housing units. But also, there's 2 buildings that each have a common area unit. Sometimes you need to do a little investigation, and in this situation, those 2 buildings that have common areas actually have a total of 26 units, but only 25 of them are low-income housing units. Now, one thing we did not mention is just because you have a common area unit, if you're not using that common area unit for site staff, those common area units must be rented to a low-income qualified household and cannot be rented out to a market unit. So sometimes a little bit of investigation needs to happen on the regulatory agreements to make sure you get the clear and precise information that you need. And here are 2 buildings that have the common area units.
I think that just about does it for our presentation. This last slide here will just give you a list of portfolio analysts, their first and last name. Their email address is basically their first and last name at WSHFC.org. However, you'll see Michael Dill is michael.n.dill. So make sure and check those out. And it does give our direct phone number. At this time right now, we are receiving messages on our phone number, but it's best to email us. Again, in your email, make sure that you list your property's name, the OID number, and then if you have any backup documentation that would pertain to your question, please send that along with it. It's always good to look at what you're looking at to be able to give you the best answer. We want to thank you for joining us, and we will look forward to posting some more of these in the very near future. Have a great day.